Welcome back to the show, World War II Books Where to Start. I'm your host, Lord Louis Mountbatten, and today I'd like to throw out a top 7 list for best Pacific War memoirs. While I was digging about in my bookshelves, I realized I do have some glaring deficiencies when it comes to this category. I've never seen an Australian memoir from the war in all these years. There's got to be some out there, but I've never yet run across one. Same for Chinese participants in the war, as well as Italian. I don't have a single memoir from an Italian combatant from the war. It's weird. Nothing from anyone in the Japanese Empire and occupied countries, so nothing from Java, Borneo, Korea, Formosa, Singapore, etc. I'm going to have to start digging to make up for this gap. So for this list, it's going to be Brits, Yanks, and Japanese memoirs only. Having said that, there's likely 100 more I haven't gotten to or aren't aware of, so this list is slanted towards the big boys in the memoir department. No getting around that. I have read many more lesser-known works in the ETO than I have in the Pacific, so at some future point when I do this thing, things are possibly going to change. I'm going to arbitrarily go with top 7 rather than 10, or best 5 with honorable mentions. I'm going to stick to the idea that it's either good enough to be here or not, no waffling allowed. I don't own all the books on the list. Some have been audiobooks only, and I'll tell you one author that's got no chance right off the rip, and that may raise some eyebrows, and that's Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie. I just don't think it's all that it's cracked up to be, and even after watching the Pacific series with his bit in there, his 2 or 3 episodes, it didn't really help it out at all. It's like, no, this is just not for me. Likewise, Dusty Kleiss isn't here. I've got his book, just haven't got around to reading him. As well, I've yet to read anything by tank crewmen from the Pacific War, so that's a category that's missing. If you think I missed a book there or a category here, I probably have maybe 2 or 3 categories. I don't know. I'm going with 7 rather than 10 because I kind of think that in the top 10, by the time you get up to the top 2 or 3, you forget who was at the bottom 10, 9, 8. That kind of fades from memory real quick. So I'm just going to be very arbitrary and chop it at 7, and we'll see how that works out. So then, with all the legal disclaimers out of the way and the ubiquitous "your mileage may vary," let's hit the books. Number 7, Japanese destroyer captain Tamichi Hara from 1961, 308 pages. I've had this copy forever. I really ought to get a better edition because honestly this one's kind of garbage, being a Ballantine War series with awful cover graphics, a stock photo we all know, and a photo section that was hardly worth the cost to stick in the book. Hara was born in 1900, accepted in Edojima in 1918, and was sent into destroyers, becoming a torpedo firing officer. Well, he realized current IJN technique for firing torpedo spreads was deficient, and he developed a new doctrine, which he was eventually to teach at the Naval Staff College. Following this, he was given a destroyer of his own to command by the time of the invasion of 37, and spent all his years of the Second World War in the tin cans until the spring of 45, when he was given the command of the light cruiser Yahagi for the final sortie of Yamato against Okinawa. That, of course, ended rather abruptly. Surviving the sinking of Yahagi, he was put in command of a unit with suicide boats as well as training civilians to fight in the skies, and thus his war ended. He's one of the rare Japanese military men to find his feet rather quickly after the war, his wife and kids surviving as well at the time of the writing of the book in 58. Great memoir, although he's apt to skip revealing his feelings about Japan's aggression and its hideous conduct towards defeated peoples and prisoners, perhaps because he was at sea and saw or heard very little of it, but he's none too reflective of his government's policies and actions. He is absorbed in telling us how he fought this war, and it's fascinating. He was very, very good at his job, and though he was ground down by the attrition and non-stop operations, he managed to survive, perform his tasks well, and live to fight on. Operating in the South Pacific for most of the conflict, he did have a cameo appearance in Midway, but his ship was in the invasion support group, so no big shakes there. The Solomons and New Guinea areas were his stomping grounds, and he saw plenty of action. I've read it maybe 3 times over the years, and it's well worth it each time, as Japanese Destroyer Captain by Tamichi Hara. Number 6, War's End by Charles Sweeney from 1997, 290 pages. I had a binge on the atomic bomb books last year, but this one I've just finished recently. Sweeney was a test pilot in the early days of the war and then transferred to Florida to take control of a military airfield where he met Paul Tibbets when he brought some Superforts into the field for training flights. He talked his way into the squadron on very scant acquaintance and made himself indispensable to Tibbets, gaining his trust and confidence until he was the right-hand man. Along the way to Tinian, he gives Charles Lindbergh a run through the Superfort and lets him fly without any classroom instruction because it's Charles Lindbergh. Same for Curtis LeMay, a very demanding boss to try to teach anything, let alone how to handle the world's most advanced aircraft, with just an hour or two's lecture. How he came to be the pilot for the Nagasaki mission and the myriad of problems and crises that mission encountered is fascinating reading or listening. You won't be able to put it down, even though you know the outcome. There's a fair amount of justification and perhaps even finger-wagging thrown at those who oppose nuclear weapons. He was hounded in TV interviews for years about it, so it's to be expected, and perhaps even needed at this point in time, to point out the obvious factors and reasons why the mission went forward. Really absorbing reading and well-written. That's War's End by Charles Sweeney. Thunder Below by Eugene Fluckey, 1992, 464 pages. All right, so I've got surface, aviation, subs all thrown out there in the first three entries. Eugene Fluckey and the USS Barb's Adventures. There's, I think, at least a dozen sub-memoirs from the Americans and the Pacific, and maybe more. I've read 6 or maybe 8 of them, and yeah, they can get pretty samey after a while. There's no getting around it. But the Barb stands out amongst the pack. You may well ask why I chose This Is at a Clear Bridge by Dick O'Kane. Good question. Maybe he's higher up the list. Maybe he's not. Who knows? It's a tough call. This man took calculated risk and outright recklessness and jumbled them together until you couldn't tell which was which and made it work. There wasn't anything he wouldn't tackle in the war against Japan, and when things were winding down in summer of '45, with no targets to sink, he came up with a new way to make subs useful by pioneering commando teams landing on the enemy shore to blow up installations and train tracks, pointing the way towards the future with Navy SEALs. If there's any downside, it's his many references by Eugene Sledge from 1981, 315 pages, and my special perhaps revealing more about himself than why this is going to. But nevertheless, it's a riveting memoir and one of the very best of the PTO. That's Thunder Below by Eugene Fluckey. With the Old Breed by Eugene Sledge from 1981, 315 pages. In my special military book club edition, Eugene Sledge, born in 1923, died 01, was a volunteer for the Marine Corps in 43, a Hollywood Marine at that, assigned to the 1st Marine Division sent to the Pacific, taking part in the assaults on Peleliu and Okinawa. With an eye for detail and great insight into the way men think in combat and why they do particular things sometimes that are just not normal, we see his war very clearly on these two very different islands and the downtime in between. While Peleliu gets the most attention, holds the memory of the reader far more readily. With time to dwell on, I think the Okinawa battle was the worst of the two for Sledge, if you can call one of them worse than the other, with the rain and the otherness of the Okinawa culture all around him, the sense of utter isolation, several thousand miles from anything he knows, setting him deeper and deeper than he had in his first campaign. It's a well-told classic of the Pacific War, not to be missed. That's With the Old Breed. My Hitch in Hell by Lester Tenney from 1995, 217 pages. An army man caught up in the Bataan Death March. Tenney's got a talent for putting you right behind his eyeballs, seeing what he saw, opening up his nerve ends so you could feel what he suffered. You experience his hunger, his pain, keying you into his sense of survival so you can scrounge, so you can network, so you can get tiny pieces of information in a prison camp in Japan that might help you survive. It's vivid, it's immediate, it's gruesome. For me, there's a vast difference in the memoirs from the ATO of Americans versus being prisoners of the Japanese. Yeah, there were awful places to be in the Stalag system, and there was hunger, there were punishments, there were work details, there was unending boredom, the isolation from home. There was even a couple hellship moments evacuating the Baltic, which I just recently learned about. It's not just the same being captured by the Japanese, it's just not. The starvation, the senseless, brutal punishments, the extremely brutal and senseless hard labor, terrifying passages from whatever island to the home islands of Japan, only to be subjected to more of the same and somehow worse torments, the uncertainty of living from one day to another. Hastings has said in one of his books, it's not wise or fruitful to compare the suffering of people in different situations. For everyone alone, their suffering is the most awful thing they've ever known and can endure. And I understand that in principle, although I've never experienced anything close to being of that kind at all. No, nothing of the kind. But in emotional terms, to read a man's description of his torture by the Japanese, if you're an American, for me, it sits deeper, it feels worse, it seems worse. It's a memoir, as I've said in my review, I really wish I had found it earlier, but now I'm glad I did find it at all. It's really astounding. It seems to hold relevantly true for many of these POWs in Japanese imprisonment. And somehow they piece themselves back together after the war, more or less, determined to make something of their survival and try not to let it dominate their lives. There are many survival memoirs of enduring Japanese imprisonment. This one feel I stands in for many others is equally as good and is not to be missed, and perhaps it can serve as a springboard for readers to find others of the same kind. That's My Hitch in Hell by Lester Tenney. So by now you've whittled it down in your mind, and you know one of these next two has to be this next thing I'm going to be talking about. Give you 3 guesses. 1, 2, 3. Samurai by Saburo Sakai from 1957, 315 pages. I knew you'd get it. I knew you would. No surprise, I should think, that this appears on the list, nor that I've placed it so high. I was addicted to aviation stories as a kid and a teen. The daring do of the pilots, their 1v1 fights, miraculous survival, and nerves of steel thrilled my young mind. At an older age, I am stunned these young men could plunge into such fights again and again, pitting skill, machine, luck, and a pinch of the unknown to come out alive, hoping by doing their best they advance their country's chances of winning the war. Sakai, while not being of deep philosophical mindset, nevertheless reveals himself to be deeply devoted to the craft of flying, as so many thousands of men in the air forces around the world in that era were. He just had that extra something that made him a tiny bit better than his opponents in many cases in the early stages of the war. But that something extra had a finite lifespan, would have pitted against superior firepower and tactics over Guadalcanal, wounding him severely and demanding every bit of his tenacity, endurance, and skill just to reach his aerodrome on return flight. After this severe wounding and wondering where he fit into the scheme of life now that his purpose to live and his one undeniable talent had been taken from him, he submits to a surgical procedure to restore his eyesight that is quite frankly a nightmare to contemplate. A risk-laden operation to partially restore his eyesight, one eye, so he might be able to risk his life again in an area of combat is somewhat incomprehensible, I gotta say. To achieve that goal, only to realize that in the time you've been out of combat, the Americans had deployed their second-generation fighter aircraft that were far superior to anything the IJN could field. It had to be devastating. No matter what his abilities and skills were, he was flying an inferior aircraft, and the only victory he could hope to win was survival, over and over. There was no way to use the skill to advance the cause of the war's goals. For Japan, there was only fly till you die. I don't think I could really say anything more to promote this memoir as a must-have and must-read, and I suspect folks watching this channel have already done so. That is Samurai by Saburo Sakai. All right, number 1, if you're paying attention at the beginning, you realize I said we had the Japanese, Americans, and the Brits on this list, and I have yet to name a Brit. So who could I be talking about? A Brit from the Pacific War? Memoir-wise, gotta be the one and only, Quartered Safe Out Here by George MacDonald Fraser from 1992, 264 pages. I feel many of you also guessed out there. A Brit, a Scot at that, as many as my number 1, and a ground pounder in Burma. Might raise many an eyebrow and cloud many a mind, but I stick by it. This is a book that's not easy going, even though it's a first-person memoir. It's really not. And if you have any affinity for audiobooks, I recommend experiencing that way rather than reading on the plain page. I really do, and I say that even though the narrator is a difficult man to enjoy as a narrator. So if all that doesn't put you off, you should plunge right ahead, okay? The narrator has a high, erudite, cynical, condescending tone that can kind of go right to your brain, extremely nasal, but it works perfectly for recounting Fraser's time at Burma as a corporal, who, if he survives, aspires to be an officer in the British Army. He tells us about his squaddies and their peculiarities, their accents, their maddening habits, the curse of fighting in the jungle with all its hazards, the smell of the Japanese versus the smell of your own troops or Indians or Gurkhas, and how that translates into survival. Punji sticks, rough terrain, falling down a well to get some nasty water in your canteen, sleeping in a burned-out streetcar and suffering more from the smell of one man's feet than where you laid down, the terror of a Japanese soldier charging you with a sword, the awfulness of the monsoon, but the camaraderie of a squad that means more than anything you can achieve in war or any fight you win against the enemy, even if you hate their guts at the same time, the silliness of it all, 7,000 miles from anywhere, fighting for reasons you can't remember. Absolutely insane officers with far higher rank than they could possibly know what to do with, commanding asinine operations that are sheer lunacy. This story has it all. Crazy humor, depths of despair, pangs of nostalgia, hatred of modernity when looking back at the good old days, affection for the Raj that will feel well out of step with today's evaluation of colonialism, and it makes you sort of kind of wish you could have been there to see it too. I know that may raise some eyebrows and perhaps ruffle some feathers. You really do feel it, that's all I can say. Max Hastings has called this the best memoir of the CBI theater, and while this is the only memoir I've read from the CBI, I have to wonder if anything else could indeed top it, and thus it gets my nod for the best memoir of the entire Pacific CBI, theater that I've read. I've listened to it twice, and honestly, having recited its virtues for you here, I could easily delve into it again without a second thought. That's my number one. So that's a wrap for my top picks for the top 7 as of 2025. Best memoirs of PTO, some of which could be construed as controversial. By definition, choosing this arbitrary number, I've left many a book off this list that could be construed as one of the greatest. Let me know what I missed and what you think may deserve better attention and better treatment. I'm willing to guess there has to be, like I said at the beginning, 100 or more memoirs from Pacific I just am not aware of or haven't got around to. So if you got a better idea for what should be on the list or a list of your own, holler at me. I am Lord Lewis Mountbatten, cousin to the king, utterly useless in Europe and sometimes a bit of a danger to those around me. But out here in the Empire, I'm actually quite useful, or so they tell me. Until next time, happy reading.